Let's go to really the crux of the matter here. The reason we had this siege of the Capitol on January 6th was the former president's false claims of voter fraud. And this week, you had the House pass a sweeping piece of legislation. Included in that were new federal standards on voter registration, vote by mail, basically voting reform. But it passed without any Republican votes. So what does this tell us about the prospects for getting federal voting reform done?
Amy, the bill is called H.R. 1 in the House. It's essentially Democrats' crown jewel of voting rights and anti-corruption measures, and it significantly bolsters voting protections all across the country. It guarantees a couple of weeks early voting everywhere. It guarantees universal access to vote by mail, which is a method that a lot of people used in the 2020 election.
I use that to go to
So what Democrats did is they passed it in the House of Representatives, which is controlled by Democrats, but now it heads to the Senate. And that piece of legislation, along with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which prevents jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination from changing their voting laws in a way that could disenfranchise or harm ethnic and racial minorities, that is headed to the Senate, and it's going to face a massive fight because it requires 60 votes to clear the Senate. Democrats have 50 votes and not a hope of getting any Republicans on board with this because the two parties are so far apart in terms of where voting rules should go. As far as Republicans are concerned, they say the biggest threat to voting right now is voter fraud. Experts and studies have repeatedly found that there is extremely little evidence that voter fraud is there, but they argue that more protections are necessary to essentially raise the bar to cast your ballot in the name of ballot integrity, the Republicans say. So that's going to be a major fight coming down the pike. I think it's all connected to the 2020 election, President Trump's reaction to it, and certain legislators and Republican officials around the country have been less than shy in pointing out that these voter restrictions would disproportionately harm Democrats.
Right. Well, that's what I want to talk about next. And I'm going to go to you about the battle over voting rights because it's being debated across the country as well as in Washington. We have Republicans in many states, as Sahil pointed out, proposing laws where they say they are meant to improve election integrity, but often they do make it harder for people of color to vote. And in Georgia this week, a bill passed that would restrict early and absentee voting. At the Supreme Court, a case involving Arizona laws that Democrats say violate the Voting Rights Act. RNC lawyer Michael Carvin defended those laws to Justice Amy Coney Barrett.
What's the interest of the Arizona RNC here in keeping, say, the out-of-precinct ballot disqualification rules on the books?
Because it puts us at a competitive disadvantage relative to Democrats.
So competitive disadvantage. Amna, I want to go with you here. Republicans in Georgia, again, that was an Arizona case. This is Georgia. House there, the state house there, passed legislation. They said they want to protect voter integrity. But when you look at some of the key provisions in this bill, Amna, there are things like restricting the number of early vote days, specifically on Sundays, when you saw a lot of, especially African-American churches, organize things called Souls to the Polls on Sundays to get folks out and voting early, restricting the ability for people to get food and water or giving food and water to people who've been waiting in a really long line. It seems like these are specifically designed to disproportionately impact people of color.
Yeah, and anyone reacting to what the Republican lawyer you heard there saying is basically saying he's saying the quiet part loud. Like the intention of a lot of these rules is to vastly restrict who is able to easily vote. And the Georgia laws that you just mentioned there are one example. Florida is also taking some action. We saw in the 2020 election like a record nearly 5 million Floridians vote by mail. And the legislators are now moving to restrict that access. And this is the connective tissue between all of this. Right, the big lie that the November 2020 election was stolen, that Joe Biden fraudulently won it, has carried forward so that now there are, I think, over 200 different laws and proposals to restrict voting access being introduced in over 40 states across the country. And this is where sort of the battle for voting rights is right now. Those laws were introduced in direct response to those election results and to the claim that there was widespread fraud, and that claim was batted batted down in court after court after court. As Sahil had mentioned as well, there just is no proof of that. The real voting fraud that's been historical and has been well documented in America has been the restriction and the disenfranchisement of communities of color, of poor Americans, of people who cannot easily get access to an ID, for example, in places that try to impose a voter ID law, who find it difficult to find transportation, to get time off from work to be able to vote during specific hours on a Tuesday in order to cast their ballots. And so these are the things that are winding their way through the courts right now. But this is the fundamental question being asked, which is, if this is a democracy and you really do have one person and one vote, there are vast efforts right now to restrict that, to limit that. And that's what we've seen happen in the past as well. So it's really a question for the state legislatures now, and whether or not the federal government can act to protect every single eligible American's right to vote.
And Jonathan, it's
Amy, on the politics of this, if I could.
That's what I was going to throw to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think for over a decade, there have been these concerns raised by Democrats that voter ID was going to drive down voter turnout. It hasn't necessarily had that effect. In fact, Democrats have still done well in quite a few races with voter ID. And I would just make the point that there's a chance that these efforts in state houses to restrict voting could actually backfire on Republicans for two reasons. One, they're going to limit some voting, perhaps at the margins, but they're going to limit some voting by their own voters. So there's that. And then secondly, just the pure politics of this. By taking these steps that are pretty obvious and even brazen, I think, in the case of some of these Georgia bills, where, limiting souls to the polls on Sundays, it's not very subtle what you're doing. The politics of that could actually invite a backlash in which you just motivate more Democrats to vote because they want to prove a point and they want to, show that this is not going to stop them from voting. So I think the politics of this are not totally clear. I get why they're doing it in the aftermath of Trump pushing the lie that he actually won the election. But I'm not so sure that in the medium and certainly in the long run that this is going to pay off.